I'm here today to talk about the ongoing government shutdown and the need to provide more security on our southern border and try to put a little perspective around it. The president just issued his own proposal. It's a reasonable proposal, I think, and a constructive proposal to try to end this shutdown and to reopen government, strengthen the southern border. I'm told we're going to vote on that plan tomorrow here in the United States Senate. It includes a lot of the ideas that I've been discussing with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, over the past few weeks. Some of these ideas are ones that Democrats support more, some that Republicans support more, so it's the basis for a compromise. I'm going to vote for the president's plan, and I'm going to explain here in a minute why I would hope that colleagues on both sides of the aisle would support that plan tomorrow as a way to take a step forward and to take a step back from the partisanship and the division that's keeping our government shut down. My hope is that even if the proposal cannot pass with a 60-vote majority, which unfortunately seems likely right now, that it will spark good faith negotiations to enable us to quickly end the government shutdown and move forward. Unfortunately, some of the partisanship and division I talked about has made that harder. It's interesting that even before the president made his announcement, but on the day that he was making it, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said the proposal was a non-starter before she knew it was in it. That's not serious. That's not the basis for a serious negotiation, and certainly not responsible for us in the middle of a partial government shutdown. I think there is, in this body, and I think in the House as well, a general consensus that we need to do more to protect the southern border. Democratic leadership in the House, Speaker of the House, have just presented a $1 billion plan, for instance, for more border security. I call it a crisis, but call it what you want. Here are the facts. During October and November of last year, the most recent months for which we have good information, Customs and Border Protection agents apprehended more than 100,000 people trying to enter our country illegally. That's nearly double the number of people who were apprehended a year ago in 2017. So twice as many people. And the big increase, as you know, is with families and kids, unaccompanied children. According to the Department of Homeland Security, there's been a 50% increase in the number of families coming across the border illegally and a 25% increase in the number of children during fiscal year 2018. Along with that, there's been a 2,000% increase over the past 5 years in asylum claims. 2,000% increase. That increase has primarily come from 3 Central American countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. While 9 out of 10 of these asylum claims are ultimately rejected by the immigration courts, the applicants have long since been released into the interior of the United States. People don't stay in detention waiting for their hearing. They're released into our communities. I'm told by Customs and Border Protection that they think about 90% of those families and children are never removed. Is that a problem? I think everybody should agree that's a problem. The system is breaking down. In fiscal year 2018, Customs and Border Protection referred nearly 50,000 unaccompanied minors, all of whom came across our southern border to seek asylum, to the Department of Health and Human Services for care. I've done a lot of work on this issue in the Homeland Security Subcommittee called Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. It's a tough situation. It's a tough situation to have these kids in any kind of detention for any kind of time. It's a tough situation for these children, many of whom have experienced trauma and violence on their journey north and need significant help. Human trafficking remains a significant problem along the border. Law enforcement officials on both sides continue to arrest people for facilitating labor and sex trafficking of adults, children, women, and children. Local law enforcement along the border repeatedly have voiced their concerns. In addition to the individuals trafficked into the United States involuntarily, criminal smuggling networks mislead prospective migrants by assuring them a safe route into the United States. This happens all the time. According to a survey by Doctors Without Borders, over 2/3 of migrants reported facing violence on the journey north. Over 2/3, including theft, extortion, torture, and sexual assault. Almost 1/3 of women report being sexually abused while being taken on that journey north to enter the United States. This is something none of us should find acceptable. Furthermore, as we know, the Drug Enforcement Agency has said, and I quote, "The southwest border remains the primary point of entry for heroin into the United States." There's no disagreement about that. I'm told that about 90% of the heroin that's flowing into our communities comes across the southern border. And fentanyl, which is this incredibly powerful synthetic opioid, 50 times more powerful than heroin, which comes primarily from China and primarily through the Postal Service, actually, but increasingly it's going through Mexico, too. Law enforcement tell me that it's being shipped from China to Mexico, then taken across the southern border. Last year, seizures of fentanyl, by the way, which are the #1 cause of death in my home state of Ohio and probably in your state, the fentanyl has increased by 135% coming across the southern border last year as compared to 2017. So again, most of it's coming from China, most of it's coming through the mail system, but increasingly it also is coming through the border. And it gets worse. Over the past few weeks, I've been at 3 meetings with drug abuse task forces in Ohio, talking about the crisis back home and how do we address it, and we're making some progress. That's the good news, and the progress is being made with regard to opioids. We're seeing fewer deaths by overdose. We're seeing fewer addictions. What we've done here in Congress to put more money into prevention and treatment and longer-term recovery and providing Narcan to our first responders and to others is beginning to work. But guess what I heard in all 3 of these task forces? Now coming up, raising its ugly head, is pure crystal meth. Methamphetamines are taking the place of opioids in some of these communities. That's the new scourge. And guess where this crystal meth is coming from? Mexico. Pure, powerful crystal meth. We've seen a 38% increase in methamphetamine trafficking across the border, again, just from 2017 to 2018. So I don't think there's any disagreement on either side of the aisle that we need a more secure southern border, not just because of people coming illegally, but because of the fact that there is trafficking, there are drugs being transported across that border, and we all want to address it. Senator Schumer, who just spoke, has talked a lot about the need for more screening at our ports of entry, because most of these drugs come in through cars and trucks. And he's right. That's in the president's proposal, by the way. So because of all those problems, the experts tell us we need to do some things. And one thing they say they need are more physical barriers. That's the experts. They also want more Border Patrol agents. They want more technology. They want more surveillance, more cameras. They want drones to be able, in some places that are out in the desert, to be able to see what's going on. They want more screening at the ports of entry, again, as Democrats have supported and I have supported. They're looking for anything they can do to try to stop this flow of drugs through technology. That takes more money. I believe the proposal the president outlined over the weekend hits all of those points, and that's why I think it's responsible. And he made clear that he is prepared to have these new barriers that he's proposing not be cement walls, which is what so many Democrats have opposed, but rather fences, including, in some places, wire pedestrian fences, in other places, low vehicle barriers, in other places, what the president has called steel barriers, but ones you see through. So that's the kind of construction we're talking about here, not the cement wall that I think a lot of people think he's proposing, because frankly, that's what they have taken from what he's said and what the Democrats have said. It's almost like we're talking past each other. Second, specifically, his proposal stipulates that these barriers would be constructed in a way consistent with the Border Security Improvement Plan. That's a plan that experts at the Customs and Border Protection Agency have proposed. So these are the experts. It's not 2,000 miles of the border that would have these fences and structures and barriers we're talking about. In the President's proposal, and this is going to surprise you, it's 234 miles. So one, not walls that are cement walls the way people are talking about, but two, it's going to be done in a way that experts recommend in terms of where they're placed and what kind of structures. And it's a total of 234 miles out of the 2,000-mile border. The 234 miles are going to support the top 10 priorities of this plan that the Customs and Border Protection people have submitted. That's this Border Security Improvement Plan. So it's going to be specifically what the experts say the top 10 priorities are. One of their top priorities, I'm told, for instance, is a new fence in parts of Texas where there is no fencing, in urban areas. That's in the plan. The White House is not making these decisions. The experts are, through this border security plan. The legislation that the President has proposed has some specific language in it saying that these barriers must be built in, quote, an operational effective design that prioritizes agent safety. That language, folks, is taken right out of the bipartisan fiscal 2018 appropriations bill that this Senate passed last year. So this is consistent with votes we've taken in the past as to what kind of wall, where the wall will be. That means the definition is one we've long voted for. As we speak, approximately 115 miles of border barrier is being built using this same definition because it was proposed and it was voted on by this chamber last year, just a year ago, on a bipartisan basis. So the $5.7 billion proposal in funding for construction of additional physical barriers along the southern border is consistent with what the experts say ought to be done. Based on the Secure Fence Act back in 2006, which again was bipartisan, more than 500 miles of fencing have already been built in California, in Arizona, and in New Mexico by previous administrations, Republican and Democrat alike. And based on the data, the actual facts, it's making a difference. Customs and Border Protection data shows that in areas where this fencing has been built, apprehensions have decreased substantially. That probably doesn't surprise you if you think about it. At a minimum, having these barriers slows people down and keeps vehicles from coming across that desert terrain, giving the Border Patrol a chance to respond, along with the technology, the cameras, the sensors. Another one of the misconceptions about this whole debate, again, is that it's over the entire 2,000-mile border. It's not. It's 234 miles. So these barriers would be strategically deployed. They would be built where they're most needed, in populated areas where there isn't already a natural barrier that keeps people from crossing. What this proposal does, as I look at it, is it fills a demonstrated infrastructure gap along the border, and only where it's necessary. Our Border Patrol experts say Texas is their top priority, as we talked about. Why? Because Texas is 1,200 miles of the 2,000-mile border, and there's only 100 miles of barriers in Texas currently. So there's over 500 miles of border that have barriers. Only 100 miles of that is in Texas, which has 1,200 miles of the border, most of the border. The new fencing is particularly necessary in the most populated parts of the Rio Grande Valley. McAllen, Texas is one example of that. To me, that makes sense because that's where about 40% of the crossings occur. And again, they're asking for this fencing there. These are the experts. In addition to funding for more barriers, the President has requested more money to hire another 750 Border Patrol agents and 2,000 additional law enforcement professionals. Again, that's something that on a bipartisan basis I think we support here, is more people to be able to respond. He also is proposing $800 million for humanitarian needs to fund enhanced medical support, transportation, and facilities for those who are detained at the border. This is consistent with what Democrats have supported to deal with the humanitarian challenge. The Homeland Security Appropriations Bill already includes funding for these purposes, but the President requested additional funds to help with the influx we've talked about. So it's like a supplemental spending request. We've had more families, more accompanied children in particular. So it makes sense to have more humanitarian funds available to deal with that. The President has also requested $563 million for 75 additional immigration judges and support staff so we can reduce the nearly 800,000 backlog of pending immigration cases. This backlog is part of our problem because people are typically in the communities. Many of them don't show up for their court cases. Reduce the backlog. That's the obvious answer here. By the way, this part of the President's proposal is identical to the proposal that Speaker Pelosi made just a few days ago. Identical. 75 new judges and support staff. Finally, the President has requested a total of $805 million for counter-narcotics and weapons technology, screening at the ports of entry. $675 million within that for reinvestment in drug and weapons detection, $130 million for canine units, training personnel, portable scanners. Again, this is one some of us feel very strongly about, including Senator Schumer, including a lot of us on this side of the aisle. It's one that is also proposed by Speaker Pelosi a few days ago. More money for screening at the ports of entry. Her proposal is almost identical to the President's, except, frankly, the President's proposes a little more money for the same purposes. It's like we're talking past each other. We know there's a need. We generally agree. There's a general consensus on the need for what has to be done along the border, and yet we can't seem to find common ground. Well, to try to get there, in addition to these funding requests, and I applaud him for this, the President outlined his support for dealing with other immigration reforms that both parties support, like DACA. I remember DACA is these young people who came here as children through no fault of their own. And the question is, do you continue the program that President Obama set in place or not? My view is, let's resolve this political football once and for all and provide certainty to these young people who came here through no fault of their own. Some of them are working, some of them are in school, some are in the military. They're looking for some certainty. And the way the legislation is drafted, this is for these young people who have taken the responsible course and gone to school or are working or in our military. This is a process where we can provide that certainty, and the President has proposed it. He's proposed taking all those children who have applied for and been accepted into this DACA program, 3 years of additional authorization to be here until past this administration. The President has also embraced an effort to look at this issue of temporary protected status, or TPS, which allows us to provide protection to individuals who come from particularly trouble-stricken countries. There are now 10 countries on that list. The Secretary of Homeland Security has the authority to be able to provide harbor to those individuals where there's a natural disaster, where there's a war, where there's a lot of violence in those countries. Some of those temporary visas, TPS visas, are expiring. And I believe here again, the President has laid out something that many Democrats have called for that makes sense, in my view, to provide, again, some more certainty for some of those individuals. Again, it's a 3-year authorization beyond the next election. The President has also talked about changing the asylum process, picking up some ideas from that side of the aisle and this side of the aisle, including having people apply for asylum in their home countries. So it's an attempt to find that common ground. Yes, be sure we have a protected southern border, but also to deal with some of these what have been political and unfortunately intractable problems. For all these reasons, I think we need to come together and negotiate a solution. I think the President's proposal is a reasonable one, and that's why I plan to support it. I know my Democratic colleagues have other ideas as well. What I've said to them this morning, last night, again this afternoon when we're meeting, Republicans and Democrats alike, is let's talk. We're not that far apart. Let's close this gap. That's what I find the most frustrating part of this. Yeah, we've had shutdowns in the past, but I don't think we've ever had a shutdown over something that's so easy to resolve because we're not that far apart. If we would stop talking past each other, including on what kind of structures we're going to put along the border, as I talked about, I think we could get there. Shutdowns, in my view, don't make sense. We're now in day 33 of this government shutdown. I'm not a big fan. I have legislation I've now introduced 5 times in Congress to say, let's end government shutdowns. It would simply continue spending from the previous year, reduce it by 1% after 120 days. another 1% after the next 90 days to incentivize Congress to get its act together and actually pass the appropriations bills. At day 33, 800,000 workers have missed one paycheck. Another paycheck's coming up tomorrow. I've heard from a lot of folks in my home state of Ohio, TSA employees, of course, at the airports, many of whom I spoke to when I came back to Washington yesterday morning. Tough situation for them. Some of them don't have the savings. They live paycheck to paycheck. They're getting by through a combination of things. Family members helping them, talking to the banks about their car payments or their mortgage payments. It's putting a lot of stress on them. I applaud them for showing up for work, by the way. Workers at NASA Glenn in Cleveland, Ohio, they can't go to work, so our space program is being slowed down. That's a problem. Across the board, I'm hearing from people who are in law enforcement, our prosecutors, saying they can't pay informants to be able to go after drug dealers. I'm hearing from our Coast Guard personnel on Lake Erie. Again, these are patriots. They're showing up for work. I applaud them for that, and I thank them, but we owe them an end to the shutdown and a resolution of this issue. I also don't like shutdowns because, frankly, as bad as it is for these families, it's also bad for taxpayers. We always end up, as taxpayers, paying more in the end. We're paying people not to work in the end because people who are furloughed are going to get their paychecks when this is over. That doesn't seem very good for taxpayers. And then people who are actually showing up for work, we're not paying them now. We'll pay them later. It's inefficient. Services are being cut off, and yet in the end, taxpayers are going to be paying for it. So it doesn't help taxpayers. I also don't like it because it hurts our economy. People say, well, not much, we're doing fine. We are doing fine thanks to the tax cuts and the tax reform and the regulatory relief. The economy is doing better. But this is running the other way. This is providing negative momentum. The Council of Economic Advisors at the White House told us this week that the shutdown is going to reduce quarterly economic growth by 0.13% for every week it lasts. In other words, every week the shutdown continues, it hurts our economy more. If it lasts another 4 weeks, the shutdown, that'll be a full point off GDP. So just another 23 days, and it'll be a full point off our GDP. That's a big deal. That hurts paychecks, it hurts jobs, it hurts the kind of economic growth all of us are so happy to finally have. To see the fact that unemployment is low, to see the fact there are more jobs out there than there are workers looking, to see the fact that wages are finally starting to increase. Let's not go the other way. We have the opportunity before us to solve this. It's not that hard. Let's stop talking past each other. Let's find that common ground. The president is going to have to continue to negotiate, and he says he will. The Speaker of the House is going to have to move. It's not responsible for her to say, not a penny more for barriers along the border that she has traditionally supported, as have other Democrats. Let's act in good faith. Let's move forward to a responsible resolution that will reopen government, but will also ensure that we have a secure southern border. That's what the American people want. That's what we should be providing here in the Senate and the House, working with the president. Let's come together and let's get it done. I yield back my time.